Last week we looked at chapter 8, and we had this episode where the scribes and Pharisees bring a woman they say they caught in adultery into the temple. And they said to Jesus, the law says that this woman should be put to death. What do you say? And they weren't necessarily interested in justice. They wanted to put Jesus in the horns of a dilemma, right? Because on one hand, if Jesus says, well, yeah, we should stone her, he'd have a lot of trouble with the Roman authorities because Jews don't have the right to carry out capital punishment. But, sort of the disingenuous nature of these scribes and Pharisees, they weren't carrying any of this out, right, before. But they wanted to see what Jesus would say. If he said that, he'd be in trouble with the Romans. But if he said, we're just going to let her go, we're going to forgive her of her sins, they're going to say, well, wait a minute, you're setting aside the law and you're a sinner. And so we can tell people that you don't obey God. And so Jesus ignored them, and then when they kept insisting, he just had his brilliant answer, right? He said, he who among you is without sin, let him be the first one to cast a stone. And they were, one by one, convicted of their conscience, and they left. And so we see that very powerful story in leading off in chapter 8. And then Jesus declares that he's the light of the world and the light of life. We talked a little bit about what that is. That light is self-evident. If I'm in a dark room and I have a lamp and I turn it on, that light will witness itself, right? I mean, if you deny that light just came into the room, you'd be a fool. Well, Jesus is the light of the world, and even the temple guards in chapter 8 acknowledge that no man has spoken like this before, and so he must be speaking the words of God. And of course, the miracles that he was doing, he's making the argument that my testimony is true. But my Father also testifies with me. But then he gets into this discussion about fathers, their father, his father, and the contrast of the fathers. He says, you claim your father is Abraham and God, but he says your father's the devil, right? And so then things in the conversation get really interesting. And we talked about last week that Jesus doesn't speak these words to them that are, we call, pretty harsh, right? Out of hatred or contempt, but out of truth and love. And we referred to Ephesians 4:15, where the Apostle Paul talks about speaking the truth and love, and that's what Jesus does because he's full of grace and truth. He's bringing truth, but he's also bringing grace. He wanted to scorch earth these people, he could have done it, right? But he's simply bringing truth. Then he concludes with this unmistakable declaration of his deity. Before Abraham was born, I am, right? And so everybody knew what that meant. He's referring to himself as the I am of God. So the crowd tries to stone him. He leaves the temple. But what we're left with is thinking about what Jesus said. A lot of things we're left with, but this light of the world statement, it carries over to chapter 9. In this chapter 9, we'll see that Jesus heals a man that was been blind from birth. And it provides a great symbolic backdrop to a discussion about spiritual sight and spiritual blindness. And so we'll see that in chapter 9. So let's go ahead and look at John chapter 9. We'll be considering that chapter this evening. Verses 1 through 12, we see the account of Jesus healing this man who's been blind from birth. And, this account is only recorded in the Gospel of John. So it's unique to the Gospel here. And we'll read verses 1 and 2. John chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. As he slips out of the temple, it says, as he passes by, verse 1, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind? And so the disciples assume, like a lot of people during this time, that his blindness or being born blind, there must have been some sin that caused this. Somebody in the family, they say him, it's kind of hard to sin in your womb, right? But he was born blind. But it's interesting when you think back to the book of Job, right? What did Job's friends, what was their conclusion to Job? What did they think caused all of Job's calamities?
Something he'd done wrong.
That's right. And so, but when you think about it, Job and his wife and what he calls his miserable friends, right? They debate all these calamities that take place in his life. And they were all wrong, every one of them, because they had incomplete knowledge, right? They were dealing with this idea of what they thought things were. And so that's what's kind of happening here with the disciples. But one before them has complete knowledge, the Son of God, God himself, who's there in the flesh. And so he speaks in verses 3 through 5. He brings the full information. He says in verses 3 through 5, "It was neither that this man sinned, nor his parents. But it was so that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me as long as it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." And so Jesus makes this statement again, and we'll see how it takes on a whole different meaning in chapter 9. That he mentions he must do the works while he's still in the world, while he's still alive. He's the light of the world, and so it's not a time to relax. It's not a time to take it easy. It's a time to shine. And he says, to his disciples, there's no reason of sin that caused this man to be born blind, but it's so that the works of God might be displayed. There's this opportunity that I can display more to the people the light of God and make an application spiritually, which he does as we conclude chapter 9. And so reading on verses 6 and 7, we see Jesus actually healing this man. It says, when he had said this, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle and applied the clay to his eyes. And he said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which translated is sent. So he went away and washed and came back seeing. So Jesus brings light to this man, right? Opening his eyes. So imagine being born blind. This man had never seen anything, never seen any colors, never seen any light. And so Jesus brings him that. And if you notice, the man doesn't call out to Jesus. Maybe one reason is because he can't see him, right? Not like some of the other people that Jesus has healed, where they cry out for mercy. But this is unprompted. Jesus sees this man, knows that he's blind from birth, and he heals him. And it's not like he immediately healed him, right? He spat on the ground, and he made from his spittle, right? So it's not very clean. You would think that there's probably an easier, better way to do this. But he makes some clay with the dirt, puts it on the guy's eyes, and he tells him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. And so if you think about it, he had to find somebody to take him there. He can't go there himself. But the point is, this man had to demonstrate some response, some faith, right? That it wasn't just Jesus saying, have your sight, and immediately he had a sight. Not that he couldn't do it. And we don't really know why Jesus did this, but it's interesting that we see this man acting in accordance with faith. If he would never washed in the pool of Siloam, he would have never been healed, right? And just the utter lack of hope. Somebody being raised, it's tough enough today, right, to be born blind. But we have a lot of things that can help deal with that in society today. Certainly be a big disadvantage. But think about it in these times. Your only really hope is to beg. And hopefully people have mercy on you and give you some money for food. That's about the only way you can live. There's no hope. And I want us to think about that as we go into this comparison, right, of spiritual sight and spiritual blindness. But in this state, this man was completely and utterly dependent and had no hope. And Jesus brought him hope by having him to see. As we read on, those that notice, the people that see him, that are around him all the time, they're like, wait a minute. We're confused, right? Verse 8 through 12. Therefore the neighbors and those who previously saw him as a beggar were saying, Is this Is this not the one that used to sit and beg? Others were saying, this is he. Still others were saying, no, but he's like him. But he kept saying, I am the one. So they were saying to him, how then were your eyes opened? And he answered, the man who is called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes, and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So I went away and washed, and I received sight. And they said to him, where is he? And he said, I do not know. And we have this account where obviously the neighbors are confused. I mean, you could imagine them, right? This is the guy that we always see begging, and now he's up and about, full sight. And they're confused. They don't really know what to do, what to think. So this man just simply recounts the experience. It's pretty simple, right? It's exactly what we read happened, what Jesus did. But he says that they asked, who was it that opened your eyes? He said it was the man called Jesus. So the way I read this, and then, he doesn't know where he's at, obviously, because he hasn't seen him, right? He's just received his sight, but probably didn't know that much about Jesus. At least that's what we see, right? He's sort of initially dealing with some maybe incomplete knowledge. Nita. Yes.
Looks trustworthy or whatever, and he's like, blood in my eyes? Sure,
What's this crazy guy doing, right? Yeah, that's a great point. And what I conclude, this is one of my actually favorite chapters in John. It's just the remarkable nature of this man, right? It's incredible that Jesus can see through and know a man, and it's to give glory to God. Judy.
Also, I don't know exactly what it means, but Jesus made the guy do something. He didn't
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it was, I think, there's always a purpose. There's always an intention for everything that Jesus does. And as we really think about it, yeah, I think it's interesting. And we can really see, especially as we go through the chapter, it can really marvel at this man who was blind, his faith, right? Yeah, Dan.
Also, I think we should realize that for this man, he thought his whole life that he had done something wrong or his parents had done something wrong. So
Yeah.
he was living in the shadow of we're not good enough. We're wrong. We did something wrong. So I'm the one that's dealing with that. And then he's healed,
Yeah.
and it's like, well, maybe I didn't.
That's a great point, right? Why am I been afflicted? What sin did I do, or my parents? And continually asking that question, Mark.
What I was thinking about is if you think what Jesus did in order to heal this blind man's eyes, he used basic materials that were there, nothing special.
Yeah.
He spit in the ground, made a clay, put it on his eyes, go wash. You think back as far as how God made man. Made him the same way. Used just regular material.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. From the dust.
And I just was thinking about that. It's pretty simple. And he healed the man's eyes with the same thing that he made man.
Yeah. No, great point. So reading on, verses 13 through 17, we see the neighbors are confused, so they figure they'll bring this man to the leaders, the religious leaders, the Pharisees. And maybe they know what to do, right? And so there's this initial investigation that we see these Pharisees doing. So verse 13 and through 15. They brought to the Pharisees the man who was formerly blind. Now it was the Sabbath on the day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also were asking him again how he received his sight, and he said to them, he applied clay to my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Pretty simple, right? I mean, that's pretty much what happened. And I think there's a little bit of a problem, though, as this was done on the Sabbath, right? And so if you remember back in chapter 5, verses 1 through 9, the paralyzed man that was healed at the pool of Bethesda, that was done on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees took exception to Jesus, right? There was quite a bit of an argument back and forth about him doing that. And they gathered that he was a sinner for violating the Sabbath. We discussed how his violation was based on their oral traditions that were added to the law, right? And Jesus very powerfully refuted that argument in chapter 5. But the Pharisees, they want to ask this man how he received his sight, and so he just simply tells them, just like what he told his neighbors, right? He just tells them the truth. And so we read verses 16 through 17. Therefore, some of the Pharisees were saying, "This man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath." But others were saying, "How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs?" And there was a division among them. So they said to the blind man again, "What do you say about him, since he opened your eyes?" And he said, "He is a prophet." And so now we see this man acting in faith initially to get his sight, but now he makes an observation, right? He's a prophet. And so what's interesting is there's a division amongst the Pharisees, right? There's division in the ranks. Some still say that he's a sinner because he violated the Sabbath, but others are saying, well, wait a minute, how can somebody be born blind and be healed? That can only come from God. And so they're having some division that's causing a problem for them. And the man just makes an observation, which is, I think, fairly straightforward. He's a prophet. He's a spokesman sent from God. He has to be a prophet. Well, Jesus is more than a prophet, but he doesn't know that, right? He makes what he sees as an initial, judgment of who Jesus is, if they ask him. And what's interesting is when we start talking about spiritual sight and spiritual blindness, this man's spiritual sight is starting to become more clear. Initially, he acts in faith, doesn't really know much about Jesus. Now he says he's a prophet based on what he sees, the evidence there, the light. And then the Pharisees' sight gets more and more clouded, right? And you'll see it as we advance through the story. But we see this starting to happen. One man's eyes being opened, and another group of people's eyes being closed to the spiritual light, the light of the world. And so now the Pharisees are a little frustrated, so they figure they'll go interrogate this guy's parents, right? Try to find some inconsistency that maybe somehow, some way, we can find that this really wasn't a miracle. And so we'll read verses 18 through 23. Verse 18, it says, "The Jews then did not believe it of him that he had been blind and had received sight, until they called the parents of the very one who had received his sight, and questioning them, saying, 'Is this your son, who you say was born blind? Then how does he now see?' And his parents answered them and said, 'We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But how he now sees, we do not know, or who opened his eyes, we do not know. Ask him, he is of age. He will speak for himself.' His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that if anyone confessed him to be the Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. For this reason, his parents said, 'He is of age, ask him.'" So the Pharisees are looking for some way to resolve their dilemma, right? And they can't have a united front against Jesus if they're divided. So they're trying to, reach and find things. They don't believe this man. They question his parents, hoping for some inconsistency, right? Go ahead, Barbara.
People that are unbelieving, they think that when he went to wash his eyes off, they substituted somebody else and brought somebody else back.
Yeah, a fake, right? Yeah, maybe it wasn't the right man. It was somebody, I don't know. They're trying to figure out, right, how could this happen? Let's go to his parents. Was he actually born blind? We want to get to the bottom of this, right? Because maybe you get a little sleight of hand here. Something's going on. And so they're just trying to hopefully find, that's how I see it, trying to find something they can cling to that would prove, Jesus, this whole thing's a fraud, right? Oh, we see what happened. Does that make sense? Yeah. So how does his parents respond? I mean, they talk about what they know and then what they don't know, right? And they know that he's their son, and know that, and I know he's been born blind, but how he now sees and who did this to him, we don't know. And that might be a fair conclusion, because perhaps they never even had a chance to talk to their son. All of a sudden, we didn't understand. They didn't understand how it happened, but we get a little bit of insight from John, the Apostle John, and he says why they said this. And what was the reason he gives that they said this? Well, they said also what? What else did they say? They said what they knew and what they didn't know, but what else? Ask him, right? So they kind of put it back on their son. And we know why, right? Because they're afraid that they're going to be cast out of the synagogue. What does that mean, being cast out of the synagogue? What would that entail? Why would that create fear, right, within his parents? Any thoughts? Barbara?
Their economics were tied to that,
Yes.
their association, so they could easily look at it.
Yeah. Imagine living in the Jewish economy and you've been excommunicated. Probably going to impact you economically. You're not going to, maybe any kind of job, any hope of having any connection to the national religion and what you believe is God, right? Through the law, through the prophet, through the priests, you're severed, right? And so they're looking at that and saying, wow, I'm going to be canceled out, right? And that put a lot of fear in them. And so they just said, look, we'll tell you what we know and what we don't know, but everything else, you got to talk to him. We don't want to take any ownership in this at all. And so we start to see that they step back, and the only conclusion that I can come to is they did know, right? Because why would John say this? And that the reason they said that, right, is because they feared the Jews. Well, why'd you fear them, right? Because if you didn't know that Jesus was the Christ, or that Jesus did this, why would you fear telling more, right, Carrie?
Being put out of the synagogue was not too much different than being considered a leper
Hmm.
in the Jewish society. They're spiritually unclean. You can't be associated with them. So they had to have suspected amongst the council there was an element there that wanted very much to accuse this so-called prophet that the man who received the sight was talking about.
Yeah.
They had to have detected some kind of undercurrent, I think, in the question that they were doing.
And it's interesting, their tactics, right? Fear, intimidation. They put it out there, right? If you confess this man to be the Christ, we're going to cast you out of the synagogue. They had it known. They made sure everyone was aware of that. What's kind of sad is the joy of their son's healing is overtaken by their fear of the Pharisees. Think about that. I mean, this is their son who just received sight, and all they can say is, ask him. It's kind of sad. And what's really telling is the son's response to the Pharisees' questions that will come later versus their response. And you're going to really see this great divide. Judy.
Backing up a little bit, the Pharisees, I didn't notice this before, but in verse 16 when they say, this man cannot be from God because he does not keep the Sabbath.
Yes.
Does that mean that Jesus, they call that work when he took the clay, when he made the clay? Is that
Healing. Yeah, healing on the Sabbath is work.
because the kids' classes are coming up.
Yeah.
I'm not going to read this Leviticus.
Yeah.
It says, do not do any laborious work. Is that considered laborious work or
Yeah.
customary work? That's not customary work
Yeah, but then it gets into like, where's your mind, right? In the minutia of the law, or the light of the light of the world and the light of life. What are you focusing on, Dance? Yeah, yeah. And the person that took him there, right? So obviously this is, just a way to get Jesus, right? And so as we read on, verses 24 through 34, there's this second interrogation that the Pharisees have of this healed blind man. And then we see this just incredibly bold and courageous defense of Jesus that he makes. Again, from limited knowledge about Jesus, but what he sees and what he knows, he acts on in an incredibly bold way. Let's look at verse 24. So a second time, the Pharisees, called the man who had been blind and said to him, "Give glory to God. We know this man's a sinner." Okay, that's a real objective, statement. Give glory to God. We know this man is a sinner. So they had obviously a preconceived conclusion, and they want to put pressure on this guy to say, yeah, just tell us he's a sinner. And, it starts to show the absolute blindness, right? This arrogant claim to absolute knowledge. We know this man is a sinner. That's the Son of God standing before you, healing a man blind from birth, but you know that he's a sinner, right? Sure. And so it's interesting. You start to see this blindness just by the very statements that they make. And the statement, give glory to God, I don't think they're looking to give glory to God. I think it calls back maybe to Joshua, right? When he confronts Achan. There's sin in the camp. Achan had taken some of the bounty from Jericho. And so in Joshua 7, verse 19, Joshua confronts Achan, says, "My son, I implore you, give glory to the Lord, the God of Israel, and give praise to him, and tell me now what you've done. Do not hide it from me." And so I think perhaps maybe that's what they're saying, like, tell us the truth. But we know this man's a sinner. So they're trying to lead him to the truth, right? But this man, it's incredible how he answers. He talks about what he knows and what he doesn't know. There's this theme about what I know and what I don't know all throughout this chapter. Verse 25, he answered, "Whether he's a sinner, I do not know. But one thing I do know, that though I was blind, I now see." Right? That's a pretty simple statement, but pretty remarkable. And it's certainly true spiritually, right? He was blind, but now he sees, right? And so that can be taken a lot of different ways. But obviously, we're talking about it physically. He was in the state of being blind and pitiful, but now he's seeing Jesus as the light of the world. And so we start to see what he means by this, that I now see, right? Verse 25. But we continue on, verses 26 through 29. And so they said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" And he answered them, "I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? You do not want to become his disciples too, do you?" And so, we see that there's a little bit of sarcasm there, right? I think, right? Because he knows these people are steeped in unbelief, right? He knows that if you confess the Christ, or Jesus is the Christ, that you're going to be put out of the synagogue. Everybody knew that. His parents knew that. He knows that. And so he kind of goads them a little bit, right? And so they're trying to, endless questions, right? And he tells him, why don't you listen to me? Why don't you hear what I have to say? And Jesus kind of had the same frustration. I mean, back just in chapter 8, verse 43, he's talking to the Pharisees. Why do you not understand what I'm saying? It's because you cannot hear my word. And they can hear him, right? Literally. But you can't hear what I'm saying. And so this man is kind of getting a bit frustrated as he's dealing with this unbelief. And he kind of plays a little bit of sarcasm. And he goes on in verse 29. And it's interesting what he says. We know that God has spoken to Moses. Or no, in verse 29, this is the Pharisees. I'll go back to verse 28. I'm sorry. After he says, you do not want to become his disciples too, do you? Verse 28. They reviled him, and they said, you are his disciple, but we are the disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he is from. So, you're his disciples, but we're the disciple of Moses. We know God spoke to Moses, but we don't know where this man's from. So what we know and what we don't know. Well, it's interesting, the response that the man gives, right? In verse 30 through 34, where he really sort of hammers it home. The remarkable response. The man answered and said to them, well, this is an amazing thing, that you don't know where he's from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is God-fearing and does his will, he hears him. We know that. Since the beginning of time, it's never been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And what a just clear, powerful statement this man makes, right, to these Pharisees, knowing the consequences, knowing he's going to get chewed up by them. And of course he does, verse 34. They answered him, you were born entirely in sins, and you're teaching us? They put him out. Get out of here, right? So they put him out of the synagogue, right? He's been excommunicated. And he has got all of these things, right? You're just like a leper. Well, okay. But he willingly, I think, did that and knew what he was doing. And he took the occasion. He didn't speak in scorn or anger or ridicule like they did. He just simply told the truth. This is what I see. Everything he said here is true. And so what's interesting is we see this dynamic, right? People speak truth. Truth exposes evil. Evil doesn't like it. Evil argues. Truth continues to show truth. And pretty soon, evil just reviles and cancels. Does that sound familiar? This happened 2,000 years ago. It's happening today, right? And Randy sort of talked about it. I mean, that's the pattern. Right? You see it, chapter 9, you see it today, right? It's not Pharisees, but yeah, Vance, go ahead.
Perhaps another pattern too is that when there's controversy or conversation regarding godly things, no one ever involves Jesus in this conversation.
Yeah.
And today, sometimes we start talking about Christianity, our relationship with God, and we get caught up in the I thinks and I feels, and nobody goes forward. And so, in a similar fashion today, go to Jesus. He is the light of the world. So there's no need to dance around that.
Yes. Because, what do we really know and what do we really don't know, right? This theme that we see in this book, or what do we think we know and what do we think we don't know? Because without the true light, we're just left to our own opinions. So, good point. Thanks, Vance. So, here's this uneducated, obviously. I mean, he's blind from birth, so he could never be educated. Uneducated man just completely shut down these Pharisees, and all they could do is say, well, we're not going to listen to you. You were born in sin. Okay, they were wrong about that too, right? Because Jesus said, no, it's not. He wasn't born in sin. But they don't say, that maybe your parents or somebody else's sin is your sin. Like, you were born entirely in sins, and you're going to teach us, get out of here, right? That's their answer. At some point, truth just continues to speak, And none of this truth is spoken hatefully, with vile. It's truth and love, right? Go ahead, Deanna.
So odd to me that the Pharisees say, we're disciples of Moses, and we're the ones that are right, and everything that they have points right to Jesus, and he's right there in front of them, they don't see him. And this guy who's blind sees Jesus.
Yeah. So incredible, irony, right, of this whole story. So finishing up, verses 39 through 40, or 35 through 38, Jesus reveals himself more fully to this healed man. Jesus heard that he'd been put out, and finding him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" And he answered, "Who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?" And Jesus said to him, "You have both seen him, and he is the one who is talking with you." And he said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. So the healed man, of course, had never seen Jesus, right? And then Jesus goes to find him. I mean, I think that's compassion upon Jesus. Like, look, I'm going to go find this guy, and I'm going to give him a little bit more complete knowledge. I'm the one that healed you. And do you believe in the Son of Man? And I am he. And when he heard that, what did he do? What does it say when he heard Jesus declare himself as the Son of Man? Did he argue with him? I mean, no, you can't be the Son of Man. You did this on a Sabbath. And what did he say? Lord, I believe. And he fell and he worshiped him, right? And so here's this blind man, uneducated, and it just shows what light can do, right? It shines. It's self-evident. Now, you can look at it and you can accept it, or you can reject it. And we can marvel at the Pharisees, but do we not marvel today, right? And part of this lesson, I think, is marvel at ourselves. What blindness do we have spiritually, right? Because we can always be quick to criticize people, but there's pockets of blindness in our life that maybe we cling to the truth, or we like truth a certain way, but we don't like truth defined maybe the way it really is according to Jesus, or some of the other things about it, and then we're kind of harsh on people, right? And so I think we can pass judgment on these Pharisees and call them blind, but I think it calls to a warning for us how easy it is to be blind, right? And by thinking what I know and what I don't know, and instead of really looking to the light, that's going to reveal what you should know. And so Jesus reveals himself more fully to the man, and we see this great display of faith, immediate recognition of that. And then he concludes the chapter, verses 39 through 41, by revealing what I see as sort of the paradox of spiritual sight and spiritual blindness. So verse 39, and Jesus said, he said to the man, I think, I'm guessing it's in the conversation, "For judgment I came into this world, so that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may become blind." Okay, he's not talking about physical things here, right? He's starting to make a spiritual application to just what's happened. And so I want you to think about this. We know that Jesus didn't come into the world to condemn it. He came in to save it, right? And that he's also full of grace and truth, John 1, verse 14. But in order for grace and truth to be brought into the world, it must reveal sin. It needs to, right? Because sin is the reason why grace and truth needs to come into the world. So I have to uncover that, and that's what Jesus is doing. And those who resist grace and truth, through their unbelief, they bind themselves to a judgment of their own sin, right? So Jesus says, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may become blind." As the light comes into the world, grace and truth will create a great divide between believers and non-believers. And that judgment will naturally occur, right? And so much of the sin that remains is the guilt of unbelief. And Jesus, in his statement, I think, just contrasts this man who had received his sight physically, and he makes a spiritual application. Because he received it physically, but we also, we see him receiving it spiritually. And he contrasts that with the spiritual blindness of the Pharisees. And of course, the Pharisees, they're within earshot, right, as we read verse 40 and 41. And so it says in verse 40, those of the Pharisees who were with him heard these things and said to him, "We are not blind too, are we?" And Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no sin. But since you say we see, your sin remains." So the Pharisees overhear this, and their real concern is, are you saying we're blind? You know, they're worried about what Jesus is saying about them. And is he calling us blind? What does he mean by that, right? Well, what does Jesus answer in verse 41? What does that mean? When you look at verse 41, he says to them, "If you were blind, you would have no sin. But since you say we see, your sin remains." What is he saying there? What do you think that point he's making? It's obviously not physical, right, Judy?
They can't see that they need him. They're blind to
Yeah.
the fact that they need Jesus.
Okay. Yeah, blind to the fact that they need Jesus, right? Blake. Yeah. And there's a lot of ways Jesus could have displayed his deity. He could have continued to just have a circus of miracles coming down, right? But that wasn't the point. He was bringing truth. He was bringing grace, appealing to people that way, using miracles to confirm that, but teaching and getting people to believe like this man that was blind. And so I think in a sense what he's saying is if you were blind, which means you had a need and a desire to see the light, if you truly were dependent and you had a need and desire to see the light, you would not have the guilt of unbelief, because that's their guilt, right? But because you say we see, and you're clinging to the light of the law, that's your light. Because you say we see, your guilt remains, the guilt of unbelief. And so the guilt remains because the only thing that can save them is Jesus, right? The light of the world, the light of life, Jesus who's full of grace and truth. And so we see, just a powerful story about a man who was a nobody, who shows this incredible faith on limited knowledge about Jesus, and was willing, based on limited knowledge of Jesus, to accept being scorned by the entire nation, being cast out. And what a great lesson, right? And sadly, we see his parents shrinking away, so we can see the contrast there. But also this idea of the light of the world, a man being healed that was blind, and the application spiritually, and I think the warning to us, right, how easily we can be blind. Cindy.
This being put out won't even be an issue in a couple weeks from now, because Christ will have risen. And this
Yeah.
being put out in synagogue will be kind of here and there.
Yeah, and pretty soon the church is coming, and so, yeah, but, the persecution and the canceling won't stop, right? It'll just ramp up. And so that's John chapter 9. Next week we'll look at John chapter 10, Jesus talking about being the good shepherd. And that'll be our last class, because the last week of May we'll have our preaching. And so we'll take a break. I'll probably pick up again in a few quarters and teach chapters 11 through 21 in John. So read through chapter 10, and we'll cover that next week, okay? All right. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.